It's a freezing morning on December 19th, 1944, near the Belgian village of Noville. Inside a camouflaged American M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, 22-year-old Private First Class Ray Thompson holds his breath. Through the foggy periscope sight, he watches dark shapes, German tanks, emerge from the lifting mist on the ridge ahead. The earth trembles from the rumble of Panzer engines. Ray's gloved hands grip the freezing metal of the 3-inch gun's elevation wheel. His orders from command are clear. Hold fire until the enemy comes within point-blank range. Yet at this very moment, a German Panzer's turret is slowly scanning in his direction. Ray can even see the glint of its long 75mm cannon. Inside the turret of the M10, his heart pounds like a drum. If he waits any longer, the Panzers will spot his position and blast his crew to pieces. In this tense heartbeat of time, Ray Thompson decides to break the rules. He squeezes the trigger and unleashes an unauthorized burst of fire, lighting a spark that will ignite the entire battlefield. Just days earlier, the quiet crossroads at Noville was merely a dot on the map of the Ardennes. Now it is about to become the arena for a desperate duel between a handful of American defenders and a German Panzer Division. To understand how Ray Thompson found himself in this life-or-death moment, we must set the stage. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, an attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Amid snow-laden pines and foggy valleys, entire German divisions surged westward, aiming to punch through thin American lines and seize the vital port of Antwerp. Caught off guard, US units reeled back. The once quiet Ardennes erupted in chaos as columns of German tanks pressed forward on narrow, icy roads. One of the Allied strong points in the onslaught's path was Bastogne, a strategic town with 7 major roads radiating outwards. If Bastogne fell, the Germans would control these crossroads and potentially split the Allied front. The US 101st Airborne Division, Screaming Eagles, and elements of the 10th Armored Division rushed into Bastogne's vicinity just in time to block the German advance. Noville, a small farming village 3 miles north of Bastogne, sat directly on the main road the Germans needed. Whoever held Noville's intersection could either shield Bastogne or open the gateway for the Panzers. Major William de Sobry, commanding Team de Sobry of the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B, was ordered to take up defensive positions in Noville on the night of December 18th. He led roughly 400 men, 15 Sherman tanks, and a few tank destroyers through heavy winter fog toward Noville. They arrived in darkness and hurriedly dug in. Paratroopers of the 1st Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne, were on the way to reinforce them, but had not yet arrived.
We need support on the left flank.
De Sobry's orders were to hold Noville at all costs, buying precious time for Bastogne's defenses to solidify.
Get it moving!
Meanwhile, barreling toward Noville from the north was the formidable German 2nd Panzer Division, led by Major General Meinrad von Lauchert. This battle-hardened unit comprised roughly 16,000 men and over 120 armored fighting vehicles, including Panzer IV medium tanks, new Panther tanks, and self-propelled assault guns. Their mission: break through at Noville, bypass Bastogne, and race west toward the Meuse River and Antwerp. Though von Lauchert had not initially been ordered to capture Bastogne itself, taking Noville's crossroads would allow his tanks to encircle or avoid Bastogne and keep up the momentum. For the German offensive to succeed, speed was crucial. They could not afford delays. At dawn on December 19th, Noville was cloaked in a dense fog. Icy wind rattled the bare trees, and a deathly silence hung over the fields. American GIs shivered in their foxholes, clutching their rifles, nerves on edge. Tank engines idled quietly behind ruined stone farmhouses. Private First Class Ray Thompson sat hunched in the turret of his M10 tank destroyer on the outskirts of the village, scanning into the gray void ahead. Ray was a gunner in an attached U.S. tank destroyer battalion, one of the specialized units equipped with fast, lightly armored vehicles designed to hunt enemy armor. His M10 Wolverine mounted a 3-inch, 76.2 mm anti-tank gun, a weapon capable of punching through German steel under the right conditions. But the M10 had its limitations. Its open-top turret left the crew exposed to the elements and shrapnel, and its guns struggled against the thick frontal armor of heavy German tanks at long range. In fact, Army reports showed that the M10's 76 mm cannon could not penetrate the front of the German Tiger or Panther tanks beyond 400 meters. The men inside these tank destroyers knew they would have to rely on stealth, speed, and well-aimed shots at flanks or weak spots to stop the German Panzers. For Ray and his crewmates, the stakes couldn't be higher. Just a few hundred yards behind them lay the road to Bastogne, crowded with medical units, supply trucks, and the headquarters of the 101st Airborne. If German tanks broke through at Noville, they could roll unopposed into Bastogne from the north, taking the town and its defenders by surprise. Hundreds of American lives and the fate of the entire front hung in the balance. Ray understood this in the abstract, but in the frozen pre-dawn gloom, more immediate concerns filled his mind. Where exactly are the Germans? When will they come? Suddenly, distant noises interrupted the quiet. The low growl of tank engines and the metallic clatter of tracks echoed through the misty fields. Ray's ears perked up. He wasn't the only one who heard it. Across the line, American tank commanders traversed their turrets toward the north, and infantrymen fingered their cold triggers, eyes strained on the fog. The order from Major Desabry was relayed to all positions. Hold fire until you see the enemy clearly. Let them come in close. The plan was to ambush the Panzers at point-blank range, where even the weaker American guns could be deadly. Surprise was their best advantage, and they could not squander it by firing too early at shadows. Ray nodded to himself in the turret, hearing the radio crackle the hold fire order. He wiped a layer of frost off his periscope's glass. Next to him, his tank destroyer's commander peered through binoculars, trying to spot targets in the haze. The crew could smell the exhaust of the unseen German column now, a bitter mix of diesel and gasoline blending with the cold air. The clanking grew louder. Ray braced his shoulder against the M10's gun breech, heart thudding. Somewhere out there, dozens of German tanks and half-tracks were approaching, and he was one of the few Americans in their way. By 10 a.m., the winter sun struggled to burn off the fog. Then, as if a curtain suddenly lifted, the fog cleared. The curtain rose on a chilling sight. A German Panzer column of about a dozen vehicles had crept within a few hundred yards of Noville. Ray's eyes went wide as he saw them clearly for the first time. Leading the column was a hulking tank that looked like a tiger, its muzzle brake and squared turret unmistakable, followed by several Panzer IVs and Panther tanks, plus half-tracks full of infantry and even a few soft-skinned trucks towing supplies. In fact, what Ray took to be a tiger, I might have been a self-propelled gun or Panther. Whatever it was, it looked massive and nearly invincible to the American defenders. The German armor fanned out as they advanced, using a skirmish line tactic. About 30 Panzers spread across a ridge to the west of Noville, while others pressed down the main paved road from the north. The columns of steel were closing in from multiple directions. Inside his M10, Ray swallowed hard. The sheer number of enemy tanks was staggering. Major Desabry and his men were up against an entire Panzer Division. Desabry had in fact been holding off the German 2nd Panzer Division all morning with his tiny force. A lesser man might have been paralyzed by fear, but Ray Thompson was about to prove he was anything but ordinary. As the German armor approached, American commanders waited for the ideal moment to spring the trap. They wanted the enemy to come well within effective range. Every American gun, Sherman 75mm, tank destroyer 3-inch, bazooka, and anti-tank grenade, needed the best shot possible to knock these Goliaths out. Ray's M10 was positioned on the western edge of Noville, covering the approaches. From his vantage point, he could see several German tanks on the ridge to his left, and others rumbling straight toward the village church spire ahead. The enemy seemed cautious but determined. No shots had been fired yet. It was the eerie calm before the storm. Ray's commander whispered over the intercom, "Steady, steady, wait for it." They intended to let the Panzers come even closer, maybe into the streets of Noville, where American bazooka teams and Shermans could hit their flanks from cover. But in war, things rarely go according to plan. Ray noticed something alarming. One of the German tanks, a Panther breaking off from the line, had stopped and rotated its turret. The long barrel swung slowly, scanning the village. Ray realized with a jolt that if he could see the Panther could potentially see him too. Their M10 was tucked behind some rubble and brush, but not entirely invisible. All it would take was one keen-eyed German gunner, and boom! The Wolverine and its crew would be torn apart by a high-velocity shell. Ray felt a bead of sweat freeze on his forehead despite the cold. Time seemed to slow down. The German Panther hesitated, as if suspicious, its commander possibly surveying Noville with binoculars. Did they spot movement? The American can't be sure. In that instant, Ray Thompson faced a fateful choice. Obey orders and hold fire, or preempt the enemy and open fire now, even though no official order had been given. He knew the plan was to ambush the Germans at closer range, but he also knew that if he waited even a few seconds longer, the Panthers might pinpoint his muzzle flash or silhouette. The radio in Ray's M10 crackled with chatter, but suddenly fell silent. The crew tried to hail their platoon leader for guidance, but only static replied. Ray's radio was dead, cutting him off from further commands. For all he knew, he was on his own. The responsibility to act, or not act, now fell squarely on his shoulders. He took a deep breath. In his mind flashed an image of Bastogne behind him, the field hospital tents, the wounded relying on the town's defense, and hundreds of paratroopers digging in expecting someone to guard their northern flank. In a split second, Ray made up his mind. To hell with it, he thought. If we wait, we die. If I fire now, we might just throw them off balance. He would risk a court-martial rather than watch those Panzers roll unchecked into his comrades. Pivot. Ray Thompson, a Kansas farm boy turned tank destroyer gunner, was about to rewrite the rulebook on ambush tactics. The moment of decision passed in a blink. Ray's world narrowed to the gun sight and the target drifting into his crosshairs. With steely resolve, he pulled the trigger. The M10's 3-inch cannon thundered, spitting a bright muzzle flash and a deafening crack that shattered the morning's silence. The first shell hurtled out at over 2,600 feet per second, leaving a trail of smoke in the frigid air. Ray's target was not the Panther staring toward him, but another vehicle further back in the column. In a stroke of tactical genius, he aimed for the rear of the German formation first. His round sailed past the front tanks and slammed into a soft-skinned fuel truck, bringing up the rear of the convoy. An instant later, an orange fireball erupted as the fuel truck exploded into a massive fire blast. The blast engulfed a half-track trailing nearby, turning it into a twisted wreck. Fiery debris rained down on the snow. The road behind the Germans was now blocked by blazing wreckage, trapping the rest of the column in a hellish bottleneck. In one shot, Ray had cut off their retreat and thrown the enemy into confusion. Before the astonished Germans could react, Ray's loader had already slammed a second armor-piercing round into the breach. Ray traversed the turret rapidly to the front of the column. Now he took aim at the lead tank, the presumed Tiger, in reality, likely a Panther, at the head of the spear. Crack! The second 3-inch round streaked out and punched into the lead Panzer's side at close range. With a blinding flash, the heavy tank shuddered to a halt. Ray's shell penetrated the side hull plating and ignited the Panther's ammunition store. In a split second, the giant machine burst into flames from within, its turret blown askew by internal blasts. The German lead tank was knocked out and left burning, effectively creating a barricade at the front of the column. 2 shots, 2 devastating hits. The German Panzer column was now both headless and tailless. For a moment, the enemy troops were stunned, caught utterly off guard by this sudden double blow. They had walked right into an ambush, but at first they thought they were facing a battery of anti-tank guns or multiple enemy tanks, due to the rapid, well-placed firing from different angles. How else could 2 widely separated targets be hit almost simultaneously? Unbeknownst to them, it was the work of just 1 gunner in 1 tank destroyer, repositioning and firing with lethal precision. Ray's commander barked, "Good hit! Keep firing!" The muzzle blast had given away their position now, so there was no point in hiding. It was kill or be killed. Ray's unauthorized burst of fire had opened the floodgates. All along Noville's perimeter, American guns erupted. Major de Sobry, hearing Ray's first shots, realized the ambush had been triggered and ordered everyone to open fire. Muzzle flashes flickered from house windows and behind hedgerows as Sherman tanks, anti-tank guns, and from them, infantry weapons joined the fray. The crack of American rifles and the whoosh of bazookas filled the air. The battle for Noville had fully ignited. German Panther tanks advanced through a Belgian village during the Battle of the Bulge. In places like Noville, such formidable Panzers with thick armor and high-velocity guns suddenly found themselves under fire from seemingly invisible anti-tank weapons as American defenders sprang their ambush. The Germans reeled from the shock. In the chaos, tank commanders yelled orders in German. "Achtung! Feindpanzer rechts! Attention! Enemy tank on the right!" They frantically swung their turrets toward the muzzle flashes flickering from Noville's edge. Cannon smoke and flying snow now obscured the fields. German infantry riding on the tanks hastily dismounted, scrambling for cover in ditches. Tracer bullets from American machine guns streaked through the air, slicing into the exposed grenadiers. Screams and shouts echoed as the Germans tried to organize a response. Ray, adrenaline surging, already had a 3rd round chambered. The M10's open turret filled with acrid smoke and the smell of burnt gunpowder. His ears rang from the gun's roar, but he focused intently on the next target, a Panzer IV medium tank that had swerved in panic and was now presenting its thinner side armor. Boom! Ray's 3rd shot smashed into the Panzer IV's flank at 400 yards, blowing its track off. The German tank ground to a halt, crippled, as its crew bailed out under a hail of American fire. 3 tanks down in as many minutes. Ray was on a deadly row. Now German fire began in earnest. Enemy tank guns flashed from the ridge, sending high-explosive shells whistling into Noville. Crack boom! A German 75mm shell struck a stone house just yards from Ray's M10, blasting it into rubble and showering the Wolverine with debris. Another shell whizzed overhead, exploding in the street behind them with a shower of snow and dirt. The concussion made Ray's teeth rattle. He and his crew knew they couldn't sit still. An M10's armor was thin, at most 1–2 inches, and any direct hit would spell doom. "Driver, back! Relocate!" the tank commander shouted. The M10's engine roared as the driver threw it into reverse. Utilizing the Wolverine's mobility, Ray's crew shuffled to a new firing position a few dozen yards away, behind a row of splintered trees. This classic shoot-and-scoot tactic paid off immediately. A moment later, a German shell obliterated the spot where they had just been, sending up a plume of smoke and snow. The Germans still thought they were engaging multiple guns. They had zeroed in on the first muzzle flash, only to find the Wolverine had already moved. As Ray's M10 skidded to a halt in its new spot, he popped up for a quick look. His eyes widened at the sight of German infantry massing to the northeast, perhaps 200 yards out. A whole company was advancing through a field to flank Noville's defenders. He shouted to the loader to switch to high explosive HE shells. The next round he sent was an HE that burst amidst the cluster of enemy infantry, throwing men to the ground and dispersing their assault. To his left, an American Sherman from Team de Sobre took advantage of the mayhem. Hiding behind a barn, the Sherman fired 3 rapid shots, taking out 3 German tanks that had gotten mired in a muddy field west of Noville. 2 Panzer IVs and a Panther in that sector brewed up in flames, their crews either dead or running. The Sherman crew then coolly traversed their gun and blasted a German half-track, adding to the carnage. All across the defensive line, similar feats of heroism were occurring. A U.S. self-propelled anti-tank gun, likely an M18 Hellcat from Ray's battalion, knocked out one of the tanks charging down the main road, while a Sherman destroyed another, effectively plugging the north-south road with 2 smoldering wrecks. In moments, the road was littered with burnt-out hulks of German armor. Amid the cacophony, Ray locked on to another target. 1 German Panzer IV had survived his opening shots and was now desperately trying to maneuver out of the death trap. Its turret was traversing toward Ray's general direction, possibly spotting the muzzle flash from his last HE round. But Ray was faster. He loaded an armor-piercing round again and let it fly. The AP shell drilled straight through the Panzer IV's frontal plate at close range. A lucky strike. With a geyser of sparks, the Panzer IV's hull blew open, smoke pouring out as its engine died. That made 4 German tanks Ray's crew had knocked out so far return fire, came thick and furious. The German tanks on the ridge, about a dozen that had spread out in a line, opened up with everything they had. They blasted high-explosive shells into Noville, tearing apart buildings where American bazooka teams lay in wait. They strafed the streets with machine gun fire, forcing GIs to keep their heads down. A deadly duel unfolded between those German ridge tanks and the U.S. tank destroyers lurking in the village. Ray's unit, the 609th Tank Destroyer Battalion platoon attached to de Sobre, proved its worth. One of the Hellcat M10 crews, inspired by Ray's initiative, took a daring chance. They raced to a forward position and got in a flank shot on a German Mark IV that was distracted firing at the town. The enemy tank erupted in flames. That same American tank destroyer quickly found another target and knocked out a second Panzer before the German gunners could adjust aim. It was as if the American TDs were conducting a deadly dance. Fire, relocate, fire again, each shot from a new angle. The Germans thought they were facing a whole ghost battery of anti-tank guns, when in reality it was just a few highly mobile crews operating with synchronized fury. Ray spotted a half-track bristling with German soldiers trying to swing around through an orchard. He traversed and fired an HE round into it, blowing the half-track apart in a flash of flame and flying metal. German troops who survived that ambush crawled away, stunned or wounded. At this point, Ray Thompson's one unauthorized burst of fire had cascaded into a full rout of the Panzer spearhead in Noville. The German column he had ambushed lay in absolute wreckage. The lead tank was destroyed, the last vehicles obliterated, and multiple panzers in between were burning or disabled. In total, American defenders in Noville knocked out an estimated 17 German tanks during this engagement, at the cost of 1 U.S. tank destroyer and a few light vehicles lost. Ray's own crew was credited with 5 of those Panzer kills, an astounding tally for a single gunner. 5 tanks eliminated, plus trucks and half-tracks, all in the span of an hour's fight. His split-second decision to open fire first had allowed him to disable multiple panzers before anyone knew what happened, catching the enemy completely off guard. The battlefield around Noville had transformed into a scene of carnage. Black smoke coiled into the sky from charred tank hulks. The cries of wounded men, in both English and German, rose into the cold air. Yet the fight was not entirely over. As the initial shock wore off, the Germans attempted to regroup. Von Laukert's 2nd Panzer Division, though bloodied, was far from defeated. More enemy tanks that had not been in the direct kill zone now began probing for another way into Noville, skirting wide to the east and west. German artillery batteries farther to the rear zeroed in on the village and started raining shells. Explosions rocked the streets, collapsing walls and sending deadly shrapnel among the defenders. Ray's M10 crew hunkered down as a barrage crashed around them, the open turret leaving them vulnerable to shell fragments. Dirt and snow flurried overhead with each concussive thud. One nearby American tank destroyer took a direct hit and burst into flames, its crew scrambling out only to be cut down by machine gun fire. War had an exacting price. Still, the Americans refused to be dislodged easily. Paratroopers of the 101st, who had marched all night to reach Noville, began to arrive on the scene by midday, reinforcing de Sobry's hard-pressed team. With fresh troops bolstering the line, the U.S. defense gained a second wind. Together, the tankers, TD crews, and airborne infantry managed to hold Noville through the rest of that brutal day, repelling several smaller German attacks. At one point in the afternoon, the Germans tried a clever ruse. A captured American Sherman tank, crewed by Germans, rolled into Noville from the north, attempting to fool the defenders. But an alert U.S. officer quickly realized the truth and shouted, "Get that son of a bah! I don't care who he is!" An American tank destroyer promptly shot the rogue Sherman, disabling it, and the German crew was gunned down as they fled. The defenders were in no mood for tricks. Their blood was up. By evening, the once peaceful hamlet of Noville was a blasted shell of itself. The village church steeple had been shattered by gunfire while flushing out snipers. Many of Noville's buildings were afire or reduced to rubble. Exhausted American soldiers, their faces smudged with soot and eyes burning from smoke, refilled ammunition and prepared for the next onslaught. And among them, PFC. Ray Thompson wiped the grime from his face and tended to his trusty M10, which had somehow survived the ferocious engagement unscathed. The open deck of the Wolverine was littered with spent shell casings. The gun barrel was hot to the touch, having fired round after round in Ray's hands. He glanced out at the wreckage he had helped create. Enemy tanks strewn like broken toys, flickering with flame. The ghost battery effect he created had clearly spooked the enemy. In hushed tones, some of Ray's fellow tank destroyer crewmen gave him a nod of respect or a pat on the back. They all knew someone had fired the first shot and set this ambush in motion, and word was spreading that it was Thompson's TD that did it. As darkness fell on Deck 19, Team de Sobry and the paratroopers still held Noville. They had survived one of the most dramatic tank engagements of the Battle of the Bulge so far. But their ordeal wasn't finished yet. What came next would test their limits even further. The Germans were regrouping for a renewed assault at dawn. And Ray Thompson, the gunner who had dared to disobey, would find himself fighting not just for Noville, but for his very survival as the battle raged on. Through the long night of December 19th to 20th, sporadic firefights and artillery barrages continued around Noville. Ray Thompson tried to catch a few moments of rest in the freezing turret of his M10. There was no warm food or shelter, just adrenaline and the fierce camaraderie of soldiers who had been through hell together. At first light on December the 20th, the German 2nd Panzer Division renewed its offensive. Von Lauchert was determined to crush this thorn in his side and break through to Bastogne. Fresh waves of panzers, supported by infantry and self-propelled guns, attacked from multiple directions. They came in larger numbers than before, indicating the Germans had brought up reinforcements overnight. By now, however, the American situation had changed. Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade's 1st Battalion of the 5/6th Parachute Infantry had fully arrived to reinforce Team de Sobry. These 19-year-old paratroopers, though weary from their forced march, immediately set about establishing stronger defensive positions. They placed bazooka teams at key choke points, laid mines on approaches, and integrated with the tank crews. Ray's tank destroyer and a few others were repositioned to cover likely armor approach routes south of Noville. Despite heroic resistance, the morning of the 20th was brutal. The Germans attacked under the cover of dense fog and smoke, learning from yesterday to get as close as possible before American gunners could pick them off. Intense close-quarters combat erupted in Noville's streets. Paratroopers with anti-tank grenades ran from building to building, ambushing Panther tanks at point-blank range. One such paratrooper, perhaps a soldier like the real-life hero PFC Francis Curry, braved enemy fire to knock out several tanks with a bazooka and even used anti-tank mines to force others back. The cost was high. Casualties mounted on both sides. Lieutenant Colonel Laprade, the airborne commander, was tragically cut down by a sniper's bullet during the chaos, underscoring the battle's deadly toll. Ray Thompson's M10 fought ferociously in these final hours at Noville. He added one more Panzer kill to his tally that morning, blasting a German tank that had attempted to flank the Americans from the east. But as the fog lifted and the Germans brought overwhelming pressure, it became clear that Noville could no longer be held. Major de Sobry had already been wounded by shrapnel and evacuated. Captain James Leach now took command of the remnants of Team de Sobry. Around noon on December 20th, with ammunition nearly expended and German armor threatening to encircle them, the order was given to withdraw from Noville and fall back to Bastogne's perimeter. In a fighting retreat, the Americans pulled out. Ray's tank destroyer served as part of the rear guard, covering the infantry as they disengaged. He fired sporadically to discourage pursuit, though he had only a few shells left. Every road was clogged, with refugees and retreating troops, but the sight of Ray's Wolverine and a few Shermans still facing the enemy gave some comfort to the weary paratroopers trudging back to Bastogne. By late afternoon, the survivors of Noville, roughly half of the original defenders, made it to friendly lines near the village of Foy. They had held Noville for nearly 2 days against a much larger force, a delay which proved crucial in the overall battle. Once safely back, Ray finally learned the full extent of their accomplishment. Their stand at Noville had badly maimed the 2nd Panzer Division, knocking out 17 of its tanks and numerous vehicles. Von Laukert's formation lost precious time and momentum. With Noville delaying them and Bastogne now heavily defended, the German spearheads were forced to divert westward, skirting Bastogne instead of seizing it on the run. This allowed Bastogne's defenders to fortify and hold out, foiling the German plan to capture the vital crossroads. Military historians note that the stubborn defense of Noville helped decide the defense during the siege of Bastogne and the fate of the entire German Ardennes offensive. In other words, the courage shown by Ray Thompson and his comrades had strategic consequences far beyond their frozen foxholes. They bought time for the Allies, and in war, time can be the difference between defeat and victory. For Ray personally, there was no parade or immediate glory. The battle continued. Bastogne itself was now encircled, and he would go on to endure the week-long siege in the snow along with the 101st Airborne. But amongst his fellow soldiers, Ray's deed did not go unnoticed. The story of an intrepid tank destroyer gunner who fired without orders and halted a column of German Panzers quickly became a bit of frontline legend. Here and there he'd earn a clap on the shoulder or a murmured, "Good shooting, kid." Perhaps a field officer put him in for a commendation or a Bronze Star for his initiative. Perhaps not. Sometimes such moments passed into history unrecorded except in the memories of those who were there. To the men of Noville and Bastogne, though, Ray Thompson was a hero, whether or not he wore a medal. German soldiers taken prisoner later recounted their version of the fight. They spoke in awe of the ghost battery that ambushed them at Noville, describing how anti-tank shells seemed to come from all directions. One Panzer grenadier, shivering in captivity, reportedly asked an American interrogator, "How many guns did you have at Noville?" The American smiled and replied, "Not as many as you think." In truth, the Germans never realized that a lone U.S. tank destroyer, manned by a single determined gunner, had inflicted a significant portion of the damage. Ray's unconventional firing pattern fooled them into believing they were hit by a full battery of guns. The psychological impact of that ambush was profound. Surviving German tank, commanders grew more wary and slowed their advance, fearful of more hidden guns lurking in the forests. Their timidity bought even more time for the American defense. And what of that unauthorized action? In the aftermath, Ray's immediate superiors surely realized that his premature trigger pull actually saved lives. Instead of facing a court-martial for disobeying the hold-fire order, PFC Thompson earned quiet praise. A company commander allegedly told him, with a wink, "Next time, wait for the order, unless you're sure you can pull off a shot like that again." Ray had taken an enormous gamble by acting on his gut instinct, but war often rewards the bold. His initiative was exactly what the desperate situation called for. As the larger Battle of the Bulge raged on, Bastogne remained a thorn in the German side, holding out until General Patton's Third Army arrived to relieve the siege on December 26th. The Germans never did reach Antwerp. Their offensive fizzled out due in large part to delays and attrition. The stand at Noville, small on the scale of the entire war, proved to be one of those pivotal moments that shaped the outcome. It demonstrated how the actions of a single soldier could ripple outward and change the course of a campaign. By the time the snows melted and spring arrived, the Allies were on the offensive and Germany was in full retreat. But the men who survived Noville would never forget those 2 days of intense combat in December 1944. They'd never forget the sight of that lone pig running through the street amid gunfire, an odd comic relief when a terrified pig broke loose during the battle, and soldiers rescued it as a mascot. They'd never forget the bravery of comrades who fell defending each other. And certainly, anyone who was with Team de Sobry on the morning of December 19th would never forget the thunderous crack of Ray Thompson's first cannon shot, the shot that signaled all hell breaking loose. At the start of this story, we saw PFC Ray Thompson alone with his conscience on that ridge outside Noville, his finger on the trigger, his orders telling him to wait, yet his instincts screaming to act. In that frozen moment, one young American gunner's act of calculated defiance changed everything. His unauthorized burst of fire obliterated a German Panzer column and stalled a major enemy advance in its tracks. Ray's bold decision set off a chain reaction. A fierce battle was won, a town was saved, and an entire division of German tanks was thrown into disarray. Reflecting on it now, it's humbling to realize how fragile history can be. What if Ray had hesitated and obeyed the standing order to hold fire? Perhaps the German tanks would have slammed into Noville at full force, catching the Americans unprepared. The 2nd Panzer Division might have stormed through to Bastogne before the defenses could solidify, altering the course of the Ardennes offensive. But instead, a single tank, destroyer gunner, took a leap into the unknown. He trusted his training, his keen eye, and a bit of farm boy daring to do what he believed was right. In doing so, he not only saved his own crew and countless fellow soldiers, but also earned a place in the annals of battlefield legend. In the snowy forests of the Ardennes, amidst one of World War II's darkest hours, the quiet thunder of Ray Thompson's cannon reminded the world that one person's courage can make all the difference. His story, the story of the Ghost Battery of Noville, remains a testament to innovation under fire and bravery against all odds. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of war faded, Ray's legacy endured. Proof that sometimes breaking the rules is what wins the battle. In the end, when the guns finally fell silent, a few battle-scarred Americans stood victorious amid the wreckage of a Panzer column that had seemed unstoppable. And at the center of that scene was one American gunner, still standing behind the smoking barrel of his 3-inch gun. He was cold, he was exhausted, but he was victorious. One instinctive act of valor had turned the tide. As we close this chapter of history, we remember PFC Ray Thompson, The man who in 30 seconds of inspired action proved that heroes are often made by the toughest decisions at the darkest of times.